So this definitely did not just happen. And it definitely was not because I was pulling it back without an arrow in it. And it definitely was not because my finger slipped and the string came forward and popped off of the bow and the cam and all that stuff. And it's definitely not the week before hunting season. And there's definitely no openings at my local bow shop. But I definitely have to find a way to fix this thing very quickly. In all honesty, I'm a bit of a boho. No, I don't mean the clothing style. I mean, I own 2 other bows besides this, but this is my newest one, and it's the one that I wanted to hunt with this year. I found this piece of 2-inch square tubing in my neighbor's scrap metal pile, so I used the bandsaw to cut it down to the length that I needed. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any 1.5 inch, so I had to purchase this piece of 1.5 inch square tubing from a metal supply. I think I paid $34 for 10 feet of it and used about 45 inches. I didn't want a butt joint on the end of it, so I used a square to mark out 45-degree angles and then used the bandsaw to cut them out, leaving one side fully intact. By doing it this way, I could very easily fold it over and have a nice clean 90-degree miter joint. Anyone that follows my channel knows that I always say that I'm not a woodworker. Well, I'm also not a welder. It's probably been 6 or 8 years since I've burned a rod. And one side of this miter joint was had a little bit too much of a gap, so I used an old trick of knocking the flux off of a welding rod, sticking it in the gap, and then welding over it. It worked pretty well. While most of my poor welding skills fall directly on my shoulders, I don't have the best welder. I paid $50 for it at a flea market several years ago, but it does get the job done. And where I lack welding skills, I make up for it with my ultimate supreme best ever grinding skills. The old saying is that a grinder is a bad welder's best friend, and once again it rang true. I need to create 2 flat end pieces for each one of these square tubing. So I found this piece of 1/4 inch flat stock in my scrap metal bin and pulled it out, marked around my tubes, and this is where I made my first mistake. Then I center punched them so I could drill pilot holes, starting with I think it was an 1/8 inch bit and some oil to keep the bit cool. And then, without adjusting the speed of my drill press, I jumped up to a 1/4 inch bit. And then I adjusted the speed down because in metal, you really want to go slower than you would with wood, especially the larger drill bits, which this is a 1/2 inch, and the 2 larger of the squares that are going to be welded to the end of the tubes need a 1/2 inch hole drilled in them. I wound up with 2 end pieces. One was 2 inches, one was 1.5 inches. Both of those had 1/2 inch holes drilled in them. And then what I'm calling ears, of which I had 4 with a 1/4 inch hole drilled in them. Then I could use the 1/2 inch threaded rod to tighten the nuts down and weld them into place on the end pieces. I was only supposed to weld the nut on the 1.5 inch piece, but I welded it on both and wound up having to cut it back off of the 2x2 plate. But as you'll see in a minute, that really didn't matter anyway. Then I could weld the plates on the end of each one of the tubes. I'm not really welding my hammer to it, I'm just holding it down here. And this is where I realized I screwed up. So just listen to Passeron explain it. So I made a mistake right here when I drilled that hole and welded that plate on the inner tube, that I didn't take account for the diameter of the wall of this pipe when I marked it out. So now I've got to either drill this out bigger or cut this off, re-drill it, or new plate, and then weld it back on. So that's what's next. So obviously I chose to remake the plate correctly this time. And so I don't leave out the viewers that watch this channel for woodworking, here's your woodworking. I'm cutting down these 1/4 inch thick red oak pieces of wood to use as spacers because I'm inserting 1.5 inch square tubing into 2 inch square tubing, and there's a little bit of gap between the two. I want to remove that gap so that there's no slop or any chance that the inner tubing will catch as I'm moving it in and out of the outer tubing. Next, I had to cut a piece of 1.5 inch tubing that was the same length as the part that I bent over earlier on the inner slide piece, and then weld it into place on the end where the shaft goes into. To make sure that the ears stayed aligned, I inserted the 1/4 inch bolt through them, clamped one side into place, tacked it down, and then slid the other side over, and then clamped it into place and tacked it down. I found the specs for bow fingers online and sent them to a friend from work that has one of those magic metal cutting machines, also known as a plasma cutter, and he cut 4 of them out for me. I requested that he cut 3/8 inch holes in the fingers for mounting, and in hindsight I should have asked for 1/4 inch. So because I'm using 1/4 inch bolts, I had to create a 1/4 inch to 3/8 inch spacer, and this 1/4 inch copper tubing is exactly those specs. To give myself a little bit of adjustability, I drilled and tapped the feet of each one of the fingers to put a 1/4 20 bolt in. This way I can adjust the angle that the fingers contact the bow limbs. They make a T-handled tool for tapping these holes with, but I don't have one, so I'm doing it the way that I was taught from my dad, which is just an adjustable wrench and go back and forth until you get all the way to the bottom of the hole. If you attempt this, make sure that you're using some sort of cutting fluid because you'll break the tap if not. I found a 1/2 inch threaded coupling that fits on this threaded rod, and that's what I'm going to use to drive the rod back and forth with. I drilled a hole through it in order to insert a cotter or keeper pin so it won't tighten or loosen off of the threaded rod as I'm driving it in and out. I chose a 1/2 inch nylon lock nut to go inside of the whole system so that it could never have the chance of tightening or loosening as I'm driving the press in and out. So the nut in the vise is actually a lock nut in this shot. Okay, to make this thing work, I've got a 1/2 inch lock nut threaded on. This is so that I can run the press back out this way without the rod going that way and having to push it in. It'll make sense in a minute. So I got this threaded on here. Now I got to start it in the sliding part. So I get that, I can insert it here. Line up that end, come through that hole, it tries to sag. All right, got that through. Show you where you can see. I've drilled a hole all the way through the threaded rod and the 1/2 inch coupling. Don't really know if I need this nut or not. I just think that it gives it something to jam nut against. Line that up about where it goes, right there. Thread this on, and I've got this little cotter pin or keeper pin to go down through the hole to keep this from moving. There we go. Bend out the little ears on the cotter pin so that it can't come back out. And I'll take this nut, come back against it, and jam it in place. And that'll alleviate some of the pressure that's going to be on that one little pin when I'm driving it in and out. So I did try this with a drill and it broke my pin, so I think it would be better just to... I couldn't come up with a better solution for protecting the limbs from the fingers, so I just made several wraps of electrical tape on each one. Just as I was finishing up the project, Queenie came in for her shift and then immediately went on break. All right, so it has an adjustment here that sets the angle for the limb as it comes into that pocket. And I don't really know what it's supposed to be set at yet, so I'm just gonna eyeball. And I built them independent from each other just in case they're not exactly perfectly flush, I could adjust them so that they would put pressure on each side of the limb in an even manner. All right, here we go. Quite literally the first time I've ever tested this out. Maybe blow apart in my face. So far, so good. I feel it important to add that I do have the limb bolts backed out as far as they'll go, so this is only like 55 pounds of tension at this point. Well, there you have it. I got the string back on. There is some string damage, so I'm going to replace the strings and cables before I tune it back up and get to go hunting with it. In the meantime, I'm going to use one of my other bows. But I've got the limb bolts cranked all the way out, so it's as low as poundage-wise as it will go right now. But yeah, just wanted to prove that I can do it myself, that I don't have to have a bow shop. Plus, I'm a tinkerer, so I like to do different things. But I'll never dry fire one again. Lesson learned. Thanks for watching.